Good afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Alumni Association's webinar series, today we present the Minohsayaki Painted Robes, a Peewaalia and Myaamia story of reclamation. Before we move forward with today's webinar, I want to first begin by sharing our land acknowledgement. Miami University is located within the traditional homelands of the Myaamia and Shawnee people, who, along with other indigenous groups, ceded these lands to the United States in the First Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. In 1972, a relationship between Miami University and the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma began and evolved into a reciprocal partnership, including the creation of the Myaamia Center at Miami University in 2001. The work of the Myaamia Center serves the Miami Tribe community and is dedicated to the revitalization of the Miami language and culture and to restoring the knowledge to the Myaamia people. Miami University and the Miami Tribe are proud of this work and of the more than 140 Myaamia students who have attended Miami since 1991 through the Myaamia Heritage Award Program. So before I turn things over to Jason Shaman, curator of exhibitions at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum, I want to remind our live viewers that you can submit a question during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button under your video. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to get us started. Welcome.
Thank you, Molly. Really appreciate the wonderful welcome and introduction to the webinar, and especially thank you for reading the land acknowledgement. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, but first, I would like to take a moment to thank several individuals and sponsors for their contributions to the exhibition and obviously this program. So Minohsayaki Painted Robes, a Peewaalia and Myaamia story of reclamation, is the product of community curation. The exhibition evolved out of a larger project titled Reclaiming Stories, developed by a committee of tribal members, scholars, and museum staff. In particular, special appreciation is extended to Charlotte Echohawk, the Director of Cultural Preservation for the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, and Julie Olds, Cultural Resources Officer for the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, along with Dr. Robert Morrissey of the University of Illinois, who helms the Reclaiming Stories Project coordinator position. Reclaiming Stories is funded by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, which is administered at the University of Illinois. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. George Ironstrack is a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and is the Assistant Director of the Myaamia Center at Miami University and also serves as the Director of Education for the Myaamia Center. Dr. Elizabeth Ellis is a citizen of the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma and is an Associate Professor of History at Princeton University. So without further ado, thank you, George and Liz.
Anyway, Jason and Molly for the nice introduction and kind words. Aya cheke te pewe naka kokewa hanungi kakikwe kinde linda kaninge. Nila Myaamia metosenya meme shikyo wenzwane. Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you here today on our computer screens. As Jason said, my name is George Ironstrack, and I'm a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. And I work here at Miami University at the Myaamia Center on behalf of my nation. And I'm really honored to be here today to share a little bit of our ongoing story of reconnection with the Minohsayaki, these painted hide robes. Muna pitia ashatikila.
Waya cheke waya te pewe neolaka koke. Liz Ellis wins Waane, Nila Peewalia, Nila Myaamiaki, and Myaamiaki Princeton University. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to talk about this project that so many wonderful folks have been involved in thinking about reclaiming and returning hide painting to the Myaamia and Peewalia communities.
So the title of our presentation today, Nujonge Sipiongeshe Yayange Mehte Kushiongeshe, is centered on our journey to Paris as communities and back again, and about bringing this knowledge back to community. But is heavily centered on our personal experiences, especially in the museum spaces in Paris, as well as our experiences in the first steps of bringing this knowledge back to our communities. And one thing I'll just emphasize at the beginning is that we're still in the very early stages. So what you're hearing is really like the first chapter of our story, and there's many, many chapters yet to be written, and I'm really excited to play whatever role I can in those chapters. But I imagine there'll be other people that will come on board that aren't even a part of the team yet who will help continue to write the chapters of this story. So here's in the opening slide a picture of Liz and I on either side of Scott Shoemaker, our friend and relative, who's also from the Myaami tribe, together with one of the Minohsayaki that's in Paris currently. But before we get started on that, just want to do a really quick introduction to our communities today. So I'll talk briefly about my community, and then Liz will talk about hers. But as the land acknowledgement laid out, the Myaami tribe's homelands were a part of what is today Ohio, but included Illinois, what is today Illinois, Indiana, parts of Michigan and Wisconsin. And after 2 forced removals, today our nation is in the northeast corner of Oklahoma, which is a really interesting slice of Indian country, nearly 40 tribes in that state today. Our community was the last to arrive in Indian territory, and we were lucky enough that our relatives in the Peoria Nation were willing to sell a part of their reservation to us. And so we moved into what became a shared reservation after the U.S. Civil War. And so today our tribal nation is based on that shared reservation in the town of Myaamia, Oklahoma. But our citizenship can be found living just about everywhere in the United States, as well as outside the boundaries of the United States. So we have around 7,000 citizens. And last we checked with our enrollment office, we had folks living in 49 of the 50 states. So we are very much a nation living in diaspora, but certainly we have a sovereign center, and we have sovereign lands, reservation lands in Oklahoma, and nearly 1,000 citizens living in the area around there. So that's where our largest pocket is. The last thing I'll just say is that diaspora presents us with a lot of educational challenges because we need to be able to reach our citizens wherever they live. And this Minohsayaki project, this Reclaiming Stories project, is taking that challenge into account in the very early days of our work. Munapetia Ashitekila.
Thanks so much. So George and I's communities, the Myaami and the Peoria communities, have really deep historical ties. We too did not originate in Oklahoma. Our homelands are in Illinois and what's present day Indiana, although we had communities that ranged as far as what's present day Arkansas, up through the Great Lakes. Our people were historically really wide spanning in terms of our networks and alliances, but we were based out of Illinois prior to removal. Today, as George said, we have been removed. Our tribal headquarters and our land base is in northeastern Oklahoma in Ottawa County. And we have a citizenry of about 3,700 at this point and growing. Our people were historically known to the French as the Illinois or the Illini Confederacy. And throughout the process of removal and then reconfederation in Oklahoma, we actually ended up absorbing parts of historical Myaami peoples. So today, the modern Peoria Nation is composed of not just Peoria people, but also Piankashaw, Weas, and Kaskaskias. So we have this really deep intertwined series of histories, which is part of the reason that it's been so wonderful to partner on this historical project with the Myamis and to work together closely as communities, because we understand that our history and a lot of our cultural heritage is deeply intertwined and is kind of co-constituted in this historical period. So as George said, we are in the process of revitalizing knowledge, language, and many parts of our kind of cultural practices that our ancestors took part in. So it's been really wonderful to be part of this research project and this intertribal consortium as we look into the Minohsayaki and the kind of ties of our ancestors.
Newe Munapetia, Newe Liz. So as we now jump into the subject of our presentation, our visits to Paris and what's sort of advanced from that work of trips to the archives. As Jason said, the Reclaiming Stories work is funded by a grant from the Mellon Foundation. But as of yet, we actually haven't made the grant-funded trip as a team to Paris yet, because as a wonderful fortuitous accident, at the same time that we were beginning this work, some of the staff at the Musée des Quai Branly Jacques Chirac were also working on a project that included the painted hide robes. And so the first two trips we've made have been to establish relationships with the staff of these museums, get to know people there. Relationship building is a key element of this work. And then to begin the thinking for a potential exhibition that will bring the painted hide robes together with other materials, historic maps, and other objects to North America after an initial show in Paris. And that's still in very, very early days, but it has an important role in the background of these initial visits. And so we, over time now, have grown very close with Paz Riguero Nunez and Leandro Verasson, who work at the Musée des Quai Branly. And we feel like there's a strong relationship building there that will serve us well into the future. So just to add a little more detail about the Reclaiming Stories project that Jason mentioned in his introduction, that it includes, of course, citizens from our two nations, but also includes non-native academics who, many of whom have been our allies for years, and others who are, newer to us, but are becoming steadfast allies. And this combination of native scholars and non-native scholars is one that has informed a lot of our language revitalization work, as has been necessary to work with scholars who had some of the knowledge necessary and vital to our communities that they have very willingly shared. And this pattern's followed in our work in Reclaiming Stories. The goal, as you'll see in the very end, is that this work of reclaiming knowledge from the archives is that it will lead to community-focused workshops and eventually, hopefully, publications that will benefit Myaamia and Peewaalia peoples.
Yeah, we have, sorry. We have always been international peoples who have relied on these external partnerships. And so for us, the working with non-native scholars, with tribal institutions, with academic institutions, and transnationally is really a continuation of the kinds of work and networks our communities have been doing for hundreds of years. So we're sort of iterating on a more modern part of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see this and hear this in the room on these initial visits, because it wasn't just Myaamia and Peewaalian people. There was, folks from the Quapaw tribe, from the Choctaw Nation in these visits. And a lot of our discussions were about our deep historical connections as well as our contemporary connections as neighbors in what was Indian Territory and is now Oklahoma. And so these are the faces of some of the people who, this is a photo from the first trip, but the names on the right represent the folks who made both trips, the trip in the spring of last year and the November. Munapiti, anything you want to add?
That's great. Thanks.
Okay. And then, our hosts, again, Paz and Leandro have been great hosts at the Musée des Quai Branly. And then they connected us with the excellent historian, a French historian, Gilles Havard, who's done a lot of work on Native North America in the very early periods. And his PhD student, Jonas Musco, is starting off wonderful work analyzing the historical maps that are in the archives in Paris. And then we were lucky enough to, be escorted into and allowed a lot of access to beautiful archives in Versailles, Vincennes, and the National Archives and National Library. So we're very grateful to have all those experiences. So we won't touch much on the archival maps today unless people have questions about it. Yep. So these are all the various places that we were taken as great guests when we were in Paris. And then, of course, we did our own traveling to visit sites. As Liz said, our people have been international people for hundreds of years. And so we went and actually visited sites that Illinois people had visited, in the 1700s. And so it was fun to travel to a place that many of us were somewhat familiar with, but to think of it as Indigenous people visiting a place that our ancestors have visited for hundreds of years. So now on to the only thing we all care about, the City of Lights and French food. No, just kidding. The Minohsayaki. So just a quick historical overview. These Minohsayaki, these painted hide robes, came to France through the colonial process. So French fur traders, diplomats, representatives of the French king met with our ancestors, members of ancestors of relative tribes, and many of these hides were given as gifts or purchased. And recognized as beautiful, really immensely valuable pieces of art from the late 1600s into the mid 1700s. And they eventually found their way into the collections of the French royal family and were used in many cases for education, the youth of the French royal family. But for myself, I've been looking at pictures of these hide robes for over 20 years, studying them as really early examples of iconography, of artwork, and of the use of color, and the use of geometric shapes that show up in later art forms. And so for me, it was a really amazing opportunity to be in the room with these beautiful works of art, and to literally see the handwork of our ancestors and be able to touch it was a really emotional experience, but also as you'll see, really valuable in terms of our research and thinking about how to bring this art form back into our community.
And I just want to underscore what Mimisheki said here in terms of thinking about the historical connections. When French missionaries and colonists and traders came to our territories, they were not coming as conquerors or people who showed up and were independently able to govern and control the land. They really showed up and were dependent upon Myaamia and Peewaaliaki peoples. And so this period, the late 17th century and the early 18th century, is really a period of reciprocal exchange and alliance, where the French really did see us as incredibly valuable allies, priority nations in North America. And so we gifted them with symbols and objects that conveyed the way that we understood our people and our values and our culture. Same as the French brought new trade items and new ideas with them, we also returned this exchange by giving objects and other kinds of knowledge back to France. And some of this is what you're seeing now in these robes, right? The way that French individuals have held on to some of the trade items and some of the gifts that we gave as evidence of our people's intertwined alliance building and our ways of knowing our world in North America. And we'll look in just a second at some more of these images up close, but I think it's really important to think about them as Peewaaliaki and Myaamia cultural productions that we then shared back to the metropole.
So I think I can't stress enough that the first time we walked into the room, I think it's fair to say we were like giddy school kids in a candy store, and we just couldn't wait to get into the room and get close to these beautiful works of art, and it was an amazing experience. Is one that I honestly never thought I would have, but hoped that future generations of Myaamia people and Peewaaliaki people would have. And to really see in this case, you can see some cross hatching on one of the Thunderbird Minohsaya, the Chinguya Minohsaya, to see like the stroke lines, the individual touches, in some cases where alamune, where vermilion was put into the robes by hand rather than by a tool, to see kind of the fingerprints of ancestral artisans was really, I just can't stress how jaw-dropping it was. And for the first hour or so with these objects, the thought wasn't even really to take pictures or take notes, but just to like stand there with kind of my jaw open as we got to lean very close and touch these beautiful objects. Myaamia, what do you want to share about your first time in the room with these Minohsayaki?
Yeah, I mean, to echo you, George, I'm so grateful to the Reclaiming Stories Project and to our partners at the Peewaalian, and of course for our tribal nations for delegating us to go over and do this work. But I think when we think about these robes, it has been hundreds of years since they have been greeted by Peoria and Myaami relatives. And so to be able to be back in the space with and talk to and be present with these objects that were so important, right? The things that our ancestors decided they wanted to leave our communities as indications of the way that we were, right? To convey and express meaning in these international contexts. It was really meaningful to get to spend time with the robes. And I think it's fair to say that it was a very emotional experience for all of us, both in terms of reconnecting with the Minohsayaki themselves, but then also, kind of following in the footsteps of our people in this journey and this set of reconnections was really special.
Yeah, Newe. I think that the first time we were in the room, there was also quapaw robes on display, and so there are folks moving around discussing their tribal history and their understandings of their robes. And it was on the second trip that we were there that I think the staff of the Peewaalian really demonstrated their trust in us, is that we were allowed sort of back in and largely left alone with the hides. And that was an amazing moment where we were much more intentional and we were able to speak our language to the hides, and that kind of connection was, I think, to me, really surprisingly emotional, as we kind of in a way said our goodbyes for a while. And I don't think I expected on that second trip to feel so emotional. It really surprised me that increasing familiarity didn't lead to making it sort of more normal, but actually led to sort of increased sense of emotional connections with the hides and a sense of loss when we have to part for a while. Was there something surprising that came out for you, or that you found in our observations, Myaamia?
I mean, I think, to echo you, Charlotte Echo Hawk, who's our cultural director, was really reminded me that part of this, in addition to us learning, is to take care of these Minohsayaki when we're over there. And so we tried our best to do that. But I think George's beautiful pictures show this much more clearly than some of the stuff that's readily available online. But being able to see the Minohsayaki in person, you can see this really fine detail in the cross-hatching and the use of clear coat. And I think in particular, and George had pointed this out, the clear coat would have functioned in a way where we could have seen the shimmering if these robes were lifted, if they were held in firelight, if they were worn, if they were hung. And so I think being present with them in person, it's much easier to get a sense of how they would have been used and loved in community, as opposed to these kind of objects that are very static, and not sort of engaged with people. What we're looking at here it was very hard to see online, but in person you can see what looks like a crest coming up from the thunderer's head. And I believe, George, you suggested that this might be a pileated woodpecker, which would be a bird that was historically really important for our communities and had kind of spiritual powers and other significance. And I think the clear coat, both for the hailstones, the kind of thunder and power symbols, and then just the way that all of this would have shimmered, is something I could not have seen online. Like George, in my nerddom, have been looking at these images for years and years. We were so excited about them, but there was so much. We're so grateful to have the chance to see them in person, because there's obviously so much you miss from afar that you can see, with the naked eye in person. You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the use of the negative space, what looks like blank canvas, in scare quotes on these Minohsayaki. What we came to find is that so-called blank space is just full of imagery, but then most of it was painted with this clear coat, probably hide glue, that would have been visible especially, shiny after application, but is faded over time. And so now is much more hidden and difficult to see in the images that are online. Another example of sort of a discovery of surprise that we had in visiting was with another Chinguia or thunder robe that's on loan from a museum, an archaeology museum in Besançon in France, but it's on loan at the Quai Branly so we can collectively do investigations with it. I didn't expect them to allow this, but we could, with help, turn the robes over. So we could see their backsides to both look at how, more closely how they were processed. But then also you could see, and this particular hide, they were painting so strongly with the black paint that there's bleed through. And what that allows you to see that can't be seen with the naked eye on the front side is you can see the stroke lines used to create the bigger, bolder lines that form kind of the edge of the designs on many of these robes. And that, again, was just really cool to see that they were clearly not using, one big tool to make these bold lines, but using the stylus that they were likely using for all the other lines to just, repeatedly create lines to draw something, bolder and thicker. But also, to me, it's more like fingerprints. You can see the individual strokes of the artist, which is, really powerful and like a signature that they've left behind. And that these robes were so supple still. They're not exactly like a fresh hide, but they're not, rigid and stiff either. They're still pretty flexible. And so it's a testament to the skill of the women who were the tanners of these hides hundreds of years ago, as well as obviously the archival process that cared for them over time, that they're still here for us in this kind of condition.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we've spent a lot of time thinking about is the production of these robes, by men, by women, likely by a whole host of hands, right? As opposed to an individual person who from start to finish takes a deer or a bison, right? And takes it through the whole process. I think we also were really struck by some of what we've come to think about as Miami Peoria style, in the sense that we were very drawn to, like George is saying, these forceful, bold lines, kind of stripped down, abstracted patterns with deep meanings in them. And the other thing you can see on this robe as well is that we tended not to process through the edge of the hide as thoroughly as the middle. So leaving some of the animal, some of the indication of what this hide came from around the edges. It's a little bit rougher. It's a little bit less processed. Which is a kind of striking reference you can see as well in this shape, that we were very aware of the animals and their role in the production of these Minohsayaki beyond, the initial stage of, okay, we've caught or we've hunted and killed a deer or a bison, but how does that continue to inform the process the whole way through?
Yeah. And as you can see on this particular Minohsayaki, there's two holes in the hide down in the lower middle section, and those most likely are the holes that were made when the animal was killed. And as you'll see later, our folks definitely had the ability to repair holes like this very nicely, but many of them, the kill shot holes were not closed up on purpose. Possibly, again, to Liz's point, as a sign of memory of the animal, that the hunting process and the processing of that animal doesn't create something that is not connected to the animal anymore, but that a memory of the animal and a reference to the animal in both the border of the hide, where you see legs and a reference to the head and antlers, as well as the wound that likely killed that animal, is all left for a viewer to see and remember. And then this particular hide has hourglass shapes running down almost the middle of it, that are very reminiscent of hair bows, which are ornamentation that Myaamia and Peewaaliya women still wear to this day, and wore certainly at the time these hides were made, and are a clear symbol of womanhood in our communities, and likely were gifted as young women transitioned into more mature adulthood by their families or clans. And so in trying to think about giving these Minohsaya names rather than just kind of the numbers that they have in the institutional record. We've at least temporarily adopted names in our language for these robes so we can refer to them in our language rather than by, the FX series of numbers that the Cave Renley uses for their objects, which is useful for museum collections, but we want to have a different way of talking about them. And so in our language, we're right now anyway, calling this the hairbow Minohsaya, the hairbow robe, so that Seke Wakana, so that we refer to it, through and perhaps in terms that the makers of these robes would understand, even if they might necessarily completely agree with, the names we chose. And this one too shows wonderful clear coat work. And so much of the space that when you're zoomed out looks like it's empty, it's actually full of clear coat work, cross hatching, other shapes and forms, geometric forms. And so that, what we find is that the whole space is really has depictions on it, even if at first glance it appears like it's empty. So here's where, once our shock wore off, we got out the cameras and started taking really close photos so that we could share this knowledge back home in our communities. So, especially where we thought things might be hard to see, we put our fingers on them and took pictures that folks don't lose track of things like these circles that probably represent hailstones, which are associated with Chingwea, with the Thunderer. And they show up on almost all of these hides. Here's a zoom in of one of the legs of the painted on a hide that represent a memory of the animal that gave up its life for the hide to be, the Minohsaya to be made.
I think you can see across some of these Minohsaya too repeating forms, things that are very referential, so that as we've been able to think about what would our Myaamia and Peoria ancestors have been able to recognize as distinctly theirs, how would they have seen their artwork, produce their artwork? These forms are things that would have coded to everyone as, that is a Myaamia and Peoria cultural production. I think it's really striking, even hundreds of years later, and being in the room with other, Quapaw robes and Choctaw objects, how distinct our work is in many ways. And again, as Minohsayaki was saying, the kind of references to thunder, to spiritual power, to hailstones have been really present in a lot of what we've looked at, which tells us, or we think it tells us, right, that this is something that's really important, that our ancestors definitely would have wanted to convey to their trading partners, their allies, and other folks. Do you want to explain the Ching?
Yeah, the Chingwea Wanganake.
Yeah.
So this robe we've taken to referring to as the Thunder Being's feathers robe, because we have stories from both the Myaamia and Peewaaliaki community of the Thunderers, obviously powerful beings who control, moisture for crops, who also can, if you're not careful, destroy things through lightning and strong winds, and that they interacted with our ancestors and oftentimes gave gifts, including a feather from their wing, which gave humans in our communities transformative powers. And these shapes show up under the wing of the Thunderers that are depicted on the other two Thunder robes. And so the Thunderers aren't on here, but what we see here is potentially their feathers, as well as a lot of the tiny circles, which represent Mizahaka, represent hailstones, which are obviously another sort of powerful weather phenomenon that came with sometimes destructive storms. So again, a way of referring to this robe that's not tied to like kind of the marking systems or the numbering systems of the colonial archive.
Perfect example of it. You miss it from a distance, but up close with these wonderful photos, you can see the power of these, the incising, the hailstones, the way that our ancestors really maximize the space, even as it looks pretty minimalist from a distance.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one I think that I had looked at the least online because it looked like it had the least on it. And then visiting it with it in person, I was like, whoa, there's a lot more on here. And so I spent obviously then a lot more time with this Minohsaya than I had sort of given it the equal time looking at it on photos. So the last of the four hide robes is a little more unique from the other three. And this one we're taking to referring to as Lanazwa Minohsaya because it's the only one of the three that's done on bison skin. The others are all on white-tailed deer skin. And this one also, as you'll see in a second, originally had the hair on the other side, like many bison robes did in this period of time. It has many of the same bold lines and many of the same color choices, but the shapes are a little bit unique and different from the other three. So it's a little more of a puzzle to us, but looks like it has kayume or pipes depicted on it, and perhaps some kind of ceremonial arrows. But this is a great example of the importance of having a mix of people in the room and collaboration. And so we had friends from the Quapaw Nation and Choctaw Nation in the room, and Ian Thompson, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Choctaw Nation, has spent a lot of time with bison and was able to walk us through how you could identify this hide as bison. And you can see here the kind of rippled rumples. That's actually where the hump was of the young bison that was harvested and made into this Minohsaya. And then you can see at the very top, kind of obscured in the vermilion that was put on by hand, as a clear coat Lanazwa or bison that was drawn into the hide next to what might be a dwelling structure. It's very hard to tell. This part of the hide was slightly damaged. So you could definitely make out the bison, but the perhaps structure to the bison's right is less obvious. And then Ian walked us through how you could see the remaining skin on the underside of the hide, which all the hair has since been sloughed off or eaten off by bugs, but that epidermis layer is still there as a sign that originally this hide, unlike the other three, still had bison hair on it at the time of production. So that was really interesting to dive more into hide tanning, which is something that prior to our first trip, neither Munapiti or I had a lot of experience with, although we did get to change that this past summer, which we'll talk about in a second. Anything you want to add about this hide, Munapiti?
Yeah, I think this is just another really great example of the ways that our ancestors continued to think about the animal and to process that through as part of the art they were making, as opposed to trying to erase it or remove it in that context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the other things that was really nice is that we had like powerful lights that the museum gave us to use, so we could look at features, see them much more closely, and sometimes you could only see features at all with a raking light. But here's an example of our ancestors' skill in repairing hides, and so it's a sign that, of course, if there was a rip or a tear or a hole and they wanted to repair it, they could, and they could repair it quite skillfully. Beautiful stitch lines that you can barely see at a distance. And it just, further evidence that the holes that are original to the hide were intentionally left because they could be closed up if they wanted to, as in this particular case here. And so here on the edge, you do see a feature that's very similar to the other hides. So it's one of the connections of shape and form where the legs of the animal are drawn and depicted, incorporated as a part of the framing design of the overall Minohsaya itself. Munapiti, anything you want to say about the visit with the hide robes before we transition to talking about community outcomes?
I think just the ability to go and visit with these robes left us, I think, with a lot of questions about wanting to understand the extent of the movement of Illinois and Myaamia productions, like intellectual productions in the world, wanting to understand, how people would have selected what they were going to trade. And then I think, again, just really thinking through the amount of hands and the amount of pupils that would have been required to produce something of this scale and of this beauty, as these really represent community projects rather than the kind of individual person, process. Anyway.
Anyway. Sorry if folks are getting background noise. It's currently hailing here right now.
Oh, George. Talk about the thunders. This is what happens.
Yeah. I'll have to put down some Masema afterwards. So, these two trips that we've made, as we said in the beginning, were with the intent of bringing knowledge back to our communities. And so this took a couple of different forms. Thus far, we've had 2 learning labs that were focused on the Reclaiming Stories team, so not the entire Myaamia and Peewaaliaki communities, with the goal of bringing additional knowledge connected to hide painting back into communities. So the first learning lab, we were lucky enough to have our friend Michael Galban, who works in Seneca Country, come and teach hide painting. So we were all able to paint small hide bags that are actually in the exhibition at the Art Museum right now. And then this past summer, we were able to have our friend Jeremy Turner come from the Shawnee tribe and teach hide tanning, brain tanning of deer hide, which is a really amazing experience. And this is preparing us to continue to build our knowledge as teams so that we can eventually create community workshops in which the entire community of both of our tribes is able to go through parts or maybe even all of this process. And so for me, I'm beginning to think of this work as really art that's going to come from our land and from our communities, collective effort. And so that the deer, the muswaya can come from the hunters in our communities, can be processed by people in our community. The minerals and pigments can come from our land. And then, of course, the artistic production can come from a team or a small group of people who together from our communities depict things on these hides. And that will be, to me, a really like holistic outcome for, research trips to Paris, right? That eventually this will come to affect anyone in our communities who wants to gain connection and knowledge from these experiences. Muna, anything you want to add about the community element?
That was really beautifully put. I think one of the things that really stands out to me, and we began this presentation by talking about the fact that we're in Oklahoma today, which is removed from our homelands. For both communities, we, this has been a process of rebirth and revitalization in Oklahoma. I think for my community in particular, many of us, my family included, had people who went through Indian boarding schools. And so the ongoing revitalization work that my tribe has been doing, even long before, and in far extent of this project, I see this as really fitting in part and parcel with the larger work that our amazing cultural team is doing at home for our community. And one of the things that is always a challenge, right, is our archives. A lot of our historical material is not near the contemporary tribal communities. And so having the chance to not just think about this stuff in France, but to bring this knowledge home, that's part of why, Bob and George and Charlotte and Julie and everyone worked on this title of Reclaiming Stories, right? This is a lot about bringing knowledge home. And that's part of what I think is really special about this exhibition at Miami University, is that it's not just focused on the Minohsayaki, right, as individual objects or as robes, but in the way that this is continuing to bring our communities together, continuing to work with these larger revitalization projects, and continuing these much longer processes of building our knowledge and culture for the 21st century at home.
Yeah, and so this leads us to the exhibition that's currently at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum here in Oxford. It's going to be open through June 8th. And this is also a key sort of deliverable element spelled out by the Reclaiming Stories grant from the Mellon Foundation. And the goal is that, using the wonderful allies and resources that we have at Miami University in the Art Museum here, we're able to community curate this exhibition, put it all together, and then it can go on the road and go to Myaamia, Oklahoma, to either the Peoria tribe or Myaamia tribe first, and then it'll go to the other tribe after that. And so it's a chance, another step down the road of introducing this knowledge to our community within a context that we've been able to curate. And so that, the story then is our collective story. And, that's a really important beginning point for this work. So just to give you a sense of that exhibition here, we have a few photos from the gallery space. There is work that has yet to start, but will eventually lead to a video walkthrough of the exhibition that, as long as it comes together well, will be publicly available. So folks who can't see the exhibition in person, either in Oxford or in Myaamia, Oklahoma, will get a chance to see it through video. But we're all really, really happy with the way it came out, and we're looking forward to the Myaamia Center hosts our community conference on May 4th. And our community members who come to town, as well as many of the Peewaalia who come to town for that conference, will get a chance to go through the exhibition in person during that conference. So we're looking forward to showing it off for them. So the exhibition includes, as I mentioned, the painted hide bags that were created at one of our workshops, 2 recreated Minohsayaki. They were made in the 21st century. Not complete copies of the ones in Paris, but kind of near copies, as well as a series of still photos of the community today in the work of hide painting, and a short video that encapsulates our hide tanning workshop this past summer. So a visitor gets to see, kind of the historical elements of hide painting, but also the contemporary work that we're doing as a community. And then also included are some of the stories or snippets or excerpts of some of the stories that help contextualize the painted hide robes today, because their context isn't just material, it's also, the stories that are in people's minds as they're creating these beautiful works of art, and in some cases recounting these stories around the hides, I imagine, while they're being worn or displayed in some way.
And I think, too, one of the things that's really special about this exhibition and the way that it's been curated by the Myaamia team and the team at the Art Museum is the way that it has focused on the contemporary, right? These things as living traditions, living storytelling, living hide painting, right? Not just stuff from the 18th century that's in a museum in France, but something that continues to shape contemporary communities. And I think having the opportunity to represent the past and present as part of a shared tradition is really unique, and one of the things that's beautifully done about this archive and this museum that doesn't just leave us in the past, but has us thinking about storytelling into the future.
Yeah. So before we move into questions, just want to make sure we say Mishinewe to the staff of the Musée de Quai Branly, the Mellon Foundation, Humanities Without Walls program, and the staff at the Department of History, University of Illinois, who have helped with a lot of the organization here. And of course, the wonderful staff at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum, who've helped organize this exhibition, and working together with our friends in the alumni office have helped put together this wonderful opportunity to share via Zoom with all of our relatives. And of course, Mishinewe to our cultural office in the Myaamia tribe and our tribal leaders who support all this work.
Yeah, and Mishinewe to our cultural office as well at Peoria, who have been steadfast and wonderful in terms of guiding and supporting this and so much other work. So Mishinewe to everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And then Jason just asked that before we move into questions that we let everyone know, or remind everyone, if you already are aware, that there'll be an in-person presentation by our friend Michael Galban on the Minohsayaki here in March at the Art Museum, March 16th from 3 to 5 p.m. And you can look for more information about that on the Art Museum's website, which I think was already put up earlier in the presentation. So I think we've got a little bit of time left for questions, or I think Munapiti and I are happy to respond to anyone's thoughts out there in Zoom land.
Well, thank you for this just fantastic presentation. It has lots of engagement, so I'm going to try to get to as many questions and comments as I can. But wow, you really brought the folks out of the woodwork today with questions and comments. So let me get started. Let's see. Scott, and I think it's really important to point out, as you mentioned, George, that while you were speaking, there was thunder and some lightning and some large hail falling here in Oxford. So while that's rare for February, it seems very appropriate for this discussion. He says he wants to know if those circles are drawn freehand or were they likely traced around a circular object. They look pretty perfect. And then someone else alluded to perhaps they were made with the barrel of a gun. Any thoughts on the math of that or the fact of that, or?
They probably weren't made with the barrel of a gun. That's been in a couple of publications about the painted hide robes. But my understanding is they're too big to be the barrel of a gun based on measurements. It does look like they were probably stamped, but what they were stamped with, we couldn't quite tell for sure. Some of them have a grain in them, so perhaps bone or wood, or maybe even something like river cane. But thus far, we haven't been able to see for sure definitively what they were stamped with, but yes, likely stamped.
Some of them also do have circles of slightly different sizes, like they were using a variety of stamps for colors, yeah. And some of them are quite small, so again, different, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see. Amanda wants to know. She asked, have these robes been scanned using any special spectral or chemical signature instruments that might show a little more clearly the clear coat or other strokes, handworking, anything like that?
Yes, the lab at the Caber-en-Laye, which is excellent, the staff there are so wonderful, have done spectral analysis on them, non-destructive testing to identify at least what the inorganic elements are of the paints. But they have not done testing, non-destructive testing, to determine what the organic elements are. My understanding is that's a lot harder to do. And so that they can say is, oh, it's organic, but they can't tell us what. And so we rely on sort of cross-reference research from hide painting in other communities to make guesses right now. But the hope is that, again, we'll learn more over time as the team continues to work about what the organic elements that make up, especially the hide glue or clear coat, and as well as some of the dyes are organic, and so we don't know plant or animal what they're made up of.
And there's some unexpected, there's some greens on some of the robes. There's colors that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find. So it's clear they're working with a really wide range of pigments, both mineral, and organic, and in terms of producing these colors.
Mm-hmm.
You've sort of answered this next question from Brooke. She wants to know if you know what the clear coat was made of. You mentioned hide glue. Can you explain that a little?
Sure. This is outside of my expertise in terms of actually doing it. So this comes from reading research. But essentially, the scraps of material you get from scraping an animal, as well as from the boiling of their bones, you can create a hide glue, which is like Elmer's glue was originally made from animals. I don't think is anymore. But the glue would then, if processed correctly, be able to be painted very clear, and you'd mix that with the minerals to create different colors, or organic substances to create different colors. Or as Munapiti was pointing out, sometimes that was painted just clear onto the hide itself. So literally, again, potentially a feedback loop from the animal to the hide, where you're actually creating the hide glue from the animal you're processing. It would have been readily available.
And it's still shiny, but you can imagine how shiny it would have been hundreds of years ago when it was first made, with this kind of, iridescent, very high shine glue or paint applied.
That it was so beautiful. Well, sort of a related question again. You mentioned different pigmentations, but Logan wants to know about that, particular pigmentation, and if there's a potential deeper meaning to those ecological resources that were used. Just sort of what's in the environment.
Yeah. So those colors, especially like the red, black, the clear coater, which is tied to white, which is the reflection of the sun. So white is connected to the notion of reflecting sunlight. And then the yellows and blues are all colors that we all still use today in our communities and art forms. And they have like layered, very important meanings. We don't usually go to great lengths to share those outside of our community, but they're connected to the kind of things that most communities are interested in, which is, the life of community, and then of course the connections to the beyond, like both the powers that are sort of beyond humans, but also the life of our ancestors after they leave this place. It's woven together with that kind of cosmology.
This is one too of those sort of those questions that brings us back to wanting to understand more about these as the production of French and Myaamia and Peoria alliances, right? Because we think about this era would have been an era when pigments were a thing Native nations really wanted because they were faster to make from France. So what percentage of these were traded in pigments or had come from across the continent? Had we traded with other people to bring those special colors through here? And again, in terms of thinking about, the new metal tools that would have made hide processing faster, easier, what were we using to process not just the hides, but the colors and the different parts? I think that this is a really important era of evolution and kind of high tech, hide making. So I think it's representative of the kind of stage of exchange that our peoples were in at that point.
Thank you. And then I have another sort of twofold question coming from Andrew. He asked, do you have a sense of how common robes like these were during the time that they were made? And do you think that your research or related research has uncovered most, if not all, examples of these robes?
I bet that there's a ton more of them lurking around somewhere. I would be surprised, not a ton, but I would be surprised if there's not more things that look similar in terms of cultural productions, tanned and worked hides. My sense is that we produced a lot of hides, and were they all as special as the Chinguya robes that were painted and designed in this way? Likely not. But I think that the scale of our production of these art forms is indicative of the fact that we have 5 of them that have survived into 2024 that we know of from one European museum, right? It's entirely possible that there is a larger corpus of work. And I wouldn't speculate on how many we produced, but I think it's safe to say that this would have been a kind of art form and a kind of product that we were producing at scale and at volume. And again, if we gave them to the French, it's my guess that we also gave them to our Native allies, and that many of these robes were loved and cared for and decayed naturally, as opposed to being preserved for hundreds of years the way that these happen.
Yeah, Wichita and Melania, I agree. And just, to add additional context, like this kind of painting would have been done on all types of clothing prior to contact with Europeans and in the early years of contact for like not everyday wear, but for special wear. And so moccasins, leggings, shirts. So what we have are these painted hide robes, but imagine an entire ensemble someone's wearing, and every piece of leather is painted to kind of go together. And then, of course, there's the tattooing on the human body, which also would have played off of or worked together with what was on these other beautiful works of art.
Oh, well, thanks to you both. We're getting close to the end of our time together, but I just want to say that there is so much appreciation, gratitude, pride that folks seem to have for you sharing these stories, for you really putting the time, effort, and energy into this research and subsequent education and passing it on. I mean, really, I will share these with you after the webinar, but it's just really wonderful to see sort of all the enthusiasm for this work and to learn about it and what you all are doing. So my gratitude personally for being here. I'm so pleased that you could join us. This has been a really great not only education experience, but a great preface to the Minohsayaki Painted Robes exhibition that will be at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum now through June 8th. If you'd like to see any of these beautiful hides sort of up close and personal, more than you could see from our camera shots. So thank you again to George and Elizabeth and to Jason, who spent a little time at the beginning, for spending some time with us today. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available later on our website today. And you can see this and any other of our webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all for joining us, and love and honor. Have a great afternoon.
Anyway,